Sean Evans's day began like any other. The hum of his delivery van was a familiar sound, almost like a second heartbeat as he navigated the quiet streets of a suburban neighborhood. The early morning sunlight streamed through the windshield, casting a soft golden glow over the dashboard. It was one of those rare, peaceful mornings when the world seemed calm, too calm. Sean had been a delivery driver for Mark's small logistics company, Speedy Ship, for over 3 years. What started as a temporary job to make ends meet had quickly become more than that. Mark had taken a chance on him when few others would, and Sean had proven his worth, moving from part-time to full-time within the first year. Mark was more than just his boss, he was a friend, a mentor, and one of the few people who believed in Sean when life threw challenge after challenge at him. Today, Sean's route took him through one of the wealthier suburbs on the outskirts of the city. The houses were large, pristine, with freshly manicured lawns and wide driveways filled with luxury cars. Sean couldn't help but feel a little out of place every time he drove through these streets. He wasn't sure if it was the wary glances from some of the homeowners or the overly polite smiles of others. Either way, he always felt like he was being watched. Sean had grown accustomed to these subtle reminders of his otherness. Being a black man in these neighborhoods often invited suspicion, even when all he was doing was delivering packages. He shrugged it off most days. He wasn't there to make friends or enemies. He was there to do his job and go home to his wife, Aisha, and their 2 kids. But still, there were days when the stairs weighed heavier than others. As he pulled up to a large beige house near the end of his route, he parked his van and grabbed the last package from the back. It was a heavy box addressed to a woman named Mrs. Pierce. He had delivered to her house a few times before. She was always nice enough, though distant. Sean figured that was her way of being polite without having to engage too much with him. He hoisted the box up onto his shoulder and made his way to the front door, ringing the doorbell. As he waited, he looked around. The street was empty, save for the occasional car passing by. Everything was quiet, peaceful, and uneventful, just another day on the job. The door swung open, and Mrs. Pierce greeted him with her usual tight-lipped smile. "Good morning, Ma," Sean said with a polite nod. "I've got your package here." "Oh, thank you," she replied, her voice brisk as she gestured toward the doorstep. "You can leave it there." Sean carefully placed the box down, then nodded once more before heading back toward the van. He didn't mind that she never offered much in the way of conversation. In fact, he preferred it that way. It was easier to keep things professional, especially in neighborhoods like this one. But as Sean reached his van, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye, a police cruiser slowly rolling down the street. His muscles tensed involuntarily. He wasn't doing anything wrong, and yet, the sight of the cruiser filled him with a familiar unease. He watched as the car passed him by, the officer inside barely glancing his way. Sean climbed back into the van and sighed, shaking off the momentary anxiety. Just a typical day, he told himself. Just a typical day. It wasn't until Sean was pulling away from Mrs. Pierce's house that he noticed the police cruiser again. This time it was parked at the corner of the street, just a few houses down. The officer was sitting inside, watching. Sean's stomach knotted up. He wasn't in the mood for this today, not that anyone ever really was. As he drove past, he saw the cruiser's lights flash on in his rearview mirror. The siren chirped once, just a brief, warning sound. Sean's heart sank. He pulled over to the curb, his mind racing through all the possible reasons the officer might have for stopping him. Maybe there was something wrong with his van? Maybe it was just a routine check? Maybe no, Sean knew better. He had seen this happen too many times to other people, to his friends, to himself. He could feel the tension building in his chest, that all too familiar tightness that came from knowing he was being singled out, not because he had done anything wrong, but because of who he was. The officer stepped out of the cruiser, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun as he approached. Sean rolled down his window, forcing himself to stay calm, to stay polite. "Good morning, Officer," Sean said, keeping his tone neutral. The officer, Officer Thompson, according to his name badge, looked Sean up and down before speaking. "License and registration," Thompson said, his voice cold, almost mechanical. Sean nodded and reached for his wallet, moving slowly, deliberately. He knew better than to make any sudden movements. As he handed over his license, he couldn't help but notice the way Thompson's eyes narrowed, like he was already suspicious, like he was waiting for Sean to give him a reason to escalate the situation. "What's the problem?" Officer Sean asked carefully, keeping his tone as neutral as possible. Officer Thompson ignored the question at first, glancing at the license before turning his attention back to Sean. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Thompson asked, his voice dripping with distrust. "I'm just making deliveries," Sean replied, gesturing to the packages in the back of the van. "I work for Speedy Ship. I've got my ID and paperwork right here if you want to see it." But Thompson didn't seem interested in the paperwork. He leaned in closer, his eyes hard and accusatory. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," Thompson said. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." Sean felt a jolt of anger surge through him, but he kept his face neutral. He knew how dangerous it could be to let his emotions show in situations like this. He had learned that lesson a long time ago. "Officer, I'm just doing my job," Sean said, keeping his voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to finish my route." Thompson's hand shifted slightly on the grip of his gun, and Sean felt his pulse quicken. This was getting out of hand. He wasn't sure how far the officer was willing to take this, but he knew he had to tread carefully. "I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Thompson said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sean hesitated for a split second, then nodded. He knew better than to argue. Slowly he opened the door and stepped out, keeping his hands visible at all times. Thompson moved closer, his eyes still cold, still filled with suspicion. "Turn around and put your hands on the van," Thompson ordered. Sean's stomach twisted. He hadn't done anything wrong, but here he was, being treated like a criminal. He clenched his jaw but complied, placing his hands on the side of the van, his heart pounding in his chest. As Thompson began to pat him down, Sean's mind raced. This wasn't just about him, this was about something much bigger. He had seen it play out in the news, in his community, time and time again. Black men, innocent men, harassed, arrested, or worse for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The thought made his blood boil, but he had no choice but to keep still, to stay quiet. As the officer continued his search, Sean's phone rang in his pocket. He couldn't answer it, of course, but he knew exactly who it was: Mark. They usually checked in with each other during the day, and Sean had no doubt that Mark would be wondering why he hadn't heard from him yet. The phone buzzed again, and this time Thompson noticed. The officer paused his search and stepped back. "You got something to hide?" Thompson asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. "No, officer," Sean replied through gritted teeth. "That's just my boss calling." Thompson frowned, clearly not satisfied. He was about to say something when another car pulled up behind the police cruiser. Sean recognized it immediately. It was Mark. Mark stepped out of his car, his face a mixture of concern and anger. He walked over quickly, his eyes scanning the situation before locking onto Officer Thompson. "What the hell is going on here?" Mark demanded, his voice sharp. Thompson straightened up, his hands still resting on his gun as he turned to face Mark. "Sir, this is none of your concern," Thompson said. "I'm conducting an investigation." "An investigation?" Mark's voice was filled with disbelief. "This man is my employee. He's doing his job, delivering packages. What exactly are you investigating?" Thompson's eyes narrowed, clearly annoyed by Mark's challenge to his authority. "We've had reports of suspicious activity," Thompson said, his tone defensive. "He matches the description of a suspect." Mark took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. He was shorter than Thompson, but no less intimidating in his anger. "This is bullshit," Mark said, his voice low and furious. "You're harassing him because he's black and in a nice neighborhood. I'm not going to stand by and let this happen." Thompson's face reddened, and he took a step forward, closing the distance between him and Mark. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Sean could feel it like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. "I suggest you step back," Sir Thompson said, his voice cold. "This is a police matter." Mark didn't move. He stood his ground, his eyes blazing with fury. "No, this is a racial profiling matter, and I won't let you ruin his life because of your bias." Sean watched the standoff between the two men, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a surge of gratitude toward Mark, but also fear. He knew how quickly these situations could escalate, and he didn't want Mark to get hurt because of him. The crowd that had gathered around the scene was growing larger, people whispering and recording the interaction on their phones. The pressure was mounting and Sean knew something had to give. Just when it seemed like the situation was about to spiral out of control, another police cruiser pulled up. A second officer, Officer Miller, stepped out, his face tight with frustration as he surveyed the scene. "What's going on here?" Thompson Miller asked, clearly trying to diffuse the tension. Thompson gestured towards Sean and Mark. "This man was acting suspiciously. I'm conducting an investigation, and this guy," he pointed at Mark, "is interfering." Miller took a deep breath and walked over to Mark, his tone much more measured. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but we need to handle this calmly," Miller said, trying to de-escalate the situation. Mark shook his head, still furious. "Calmly? You're treating him like a criminal for doing his job. This is absurd." Miller glanced at Sean, then back at Mark. "Let's all take a step back and talk about this." Mark reluctantly nodded, but the anger in his eyes didn't fade. He stepped back, but his presence still loomed large in the confrontation. The crowd, now larger and buzzing with conversation, was recording every word, every gesture. Sean stood frozen, his hands still on the side of the van, feeling helpless in the middle of this standoff. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd behind him, feel the eyes of everyone around him, and yet he felt invisible, like an object of spectacle rather than a person with dignity. The tension was palpable, almost electric in the air, as Officer Miller tried to calm the situation down, but the damage had already been done. Sean could still feel Officer Thompson's eyes boring into him, the weight of suspicion pressing down like an invisible hand choking his freedom. The crowd that had gathered only made it worse, every person recording, every whisper carrying a sharp edge, slicing into the already fragile moment. Sean's mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about his family, his wife, Aisha, and their 2 children, Malik and Kendra. What would happen if this went sideways? Would they have to hear that their father had been arrested, or worse, over nothing more than a delivery in the wrong neighborhood? The thought chilled him, and he fought to keep his breath steady. Mark stood his ground a few feet away, his fury barely restrained, but his words carried a level of control Sean admired. He had known Mark for years, and one thing he appreciated was his boss's unwavering dedication to fairness. But this time it wasn't just business, it was personal. Sean wasn't just an employee, he was a friend, and Mark wouldn't stand by while his friend was being harassed. "Officer Miller, you need to let him go," Mark said firmly, stepping forward again, though careful not to get too close to Officer Thompson. "Sean hasn't done anything wrong, and you're escalating this situation for no reason." Miller turned to Thompson, trying to gauge the next move. There was a flicker of hesitation in Miller's eyes, the kind that suggested he didn't want this to go further, but Thompson's ego was already bruised. The officer wasn't about to let someone like Mark, someone who clearly didn't respect his authority, dictate how this was going to end. "You don't understand the situation here," Thompson barked, clearly fed up with the interruptions. "This is a police matter. Your employee was acting suspiciously, and I'm just doing my job." "Suspiciously?" Mark shot back. "Because he's black and driving a delivery van in a white neighborhood? That's your definition of suspicious." The crowd murmured louder, people nodding in agreement with Mark. Someone in the back shouted, "He's right. This is profiling." Others held up their phones, capturing every moment, every word. The situation was already out of the officer's control, and Thompson knew it. Thompson's face reddened further. "You need to back off, sir, or I'll have you arrested for obstruction." Mark took a breath, clearly weighing his next move. He wasn't a reckless man, but he was principled. Sean could tell that Mark was holding back the urge to get in Thompson's face, but his instincts told him that if this escalated further, it could end badly for everyone. Sean, standing by the van with his hands still visible, finally spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Thompson, I'm just trying to do my job. I have all the documentation you need. Please, let's just resolve this peacefully." Thompson, however, wasn't listening. His eyes had narrowed, his jaw clenched. Sean could see it, the thin veneer of professionalism cracking under the pressure of the crowd, the cameras, and Mark's refusal to back down. Thompson had made his mind up the moment he'd seen Sean, and no amount of reason was going to change that. Meanwhile, back at home, Aisha was preparing dinner, unaware of the unfolding chaos. The smell of simmering stew filled the air, and Malik and Kendra played in the living room, laughing as they built towers with their blocks. Everything was peaceful, routine, until Aisha's phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it, seeing a notification from her neighbor's social media page. Her stomach dropped when she read the caption, "Police harassing a delivery driver in our neighborhood." Aisha's heart started to race as she tapped the video, the screen filling with shaky footage of the scene she knew all too well. The moment she saw Sean's van, she froze. It took her a second to process what she was looking at, but once she saw him, her husband, standing there, hands on the van, while two officers hovered around him, she felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Malik's small voice pulled her out of her daze. Aisha quickly pocketed the phone, forcing a tight smile. "Nothing, sweetie. Go play with your sister, okay?" But inside, she was unraveling. She grabbed her phone and immediately dialed Sean's number, her fingers trembling. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. Panic surged through her. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit here while her husband was being harassed by the police. Quickly, she scrolled through her contacts and found the number of Tasha, one of the local activists she had met through a community outreach program. If anyone knew how to handle situations like this, it was Tasha. "Tasha, it's Aisha," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Something's happening to Sean. The police, they've stopped him, and it's escalating." Tasha didn't hesitate. "Send me the video and the location. I'll get people on it right now." Aisha nodded, even though Tasha couldn't see her. "Thank you. Please, just get there." "I'm on it, Aisha. We'll handle this." Back at the scene, the crowd had grown even larger. People from nearby houses had come out to see what was happening, and more phones were raised, capturing the confrontation from every angle. It was no longer just a simple traffic stop. It had become an event, something bigger than anyone there could have anticipated. Sean could feel the weight of all those eyes on him. The heat of the sun was starting to feel oppressive, and the murmurs from the crowd only heightened the sense of danger. He didn't want this to become a spectacle, but he also knew that having witnesses might be the only thing keeping the situation from spiraling out of control. Officer Miller stepped forward again, trying to speak over the rising noise. "Okay, everyone, let's calm down. We're just trying to figure out what's going on here." Mark, standing his ground, pointed at Sean. "What's going on is that you've got an innocent man in handcuffs for doing his job. You want to de-escalate, then let him go." Thompson wasn't backing down. "We don't take orders from you, sir." The hostility in Thompson's voice wasn't lost on anyone. It was the kind of tone that came from years of unchecked authority, the kind that made it clear he wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Mark, someone who wouldn't just quietly step aside. But the crowd wasn't on Thompson's side. People started shouting, their voices rising above the murmurs. "Let him go. This is profiling. You're just harassing him." Thompson's face twisted in frustration as he looked around, clearly feeling the pressure. His hand hovered near his gun, and Sean's stomach clenched at the sight. This could go bad fast. Sean took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He couldn't let this turn into something worse. He didn't want to be another name in a headline, another black man in a viral video of police violence. "Officer Thompson," Sean said, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear, "I've got my paperwork in the van. Can we please just look at that and settle this?" Thompson glared at him, but before he could respond, a loud voice broke through the crowd. "Sean." Aisha pushed her way through the bystanders, her eyes wild with fear as she ran toward the scene. The moment she saw him, her face crumpled in relief, but the panic in her eyes didn't fade. "Oh my God, Sean," she said, rushing to his side. "Are you okay?" Sean nodded, though his heart was still pounding in his chest. "I'm fine, Aisha. It's okay." But Aisha wasn't convinced. She turned to the officers, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and anger. "What are you doing to my husband? He's just delivering packages. He hasn't done anything wrong." Mark stepped closer to Aisha, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They're harassing him, Aisha, but we're not going to let this slide." The situation was at its boiling point. Thompson's hand was now firmly resting on his gun, his face tight with anger and frustration. The crowd had grown larger, the shouts more frequent. and the tension was like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. "Step back," Mon Thompson ordered, his voice low and dangerous. "This is a police matter." Aisha shook her head, her hands trembling. "No, this is harassment. You're profiling him because he's black. I've seen this happen before, and I won't let it happen again." Thompson's face twisted in frustration. "You need to back off now, or I'll arrest you too." The crowd gasped at the officer's threat, and several people shouted in protest. But before anyone could escalate the situation further, Officer Miller stepped between them, his voice calm but firm. "Everyone just take a step back," Miller said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Let's talk this out." Mark, still simmering with anger, pointed at Sean. "You want to de-escalate? Let him go, right now. He's got nothing to do with whatever suspicious activity you think is happening here." Thompson was about to argue, but Miller interrupted. "Thompson, let's look at his paperwork and sort this out." Thompson hesitated, his eyes flicking between Miller, Sean, and the growing crowd. He was losing control, and he knew it. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and no matter how hard he tried to assert his authority, it was slipping away. Finally, with a sharp exhale, Thompson stepped back. "Fine," he muttered, clearly seething. "Let's see the paperwork." Sean let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands were still shaking, but he kept them steady as he reached for the van door, opening it to retrieve the delivery manifest and his ID. He handed the documents to Officer Miller, who looked them over carefully. After what felt like an eternity, Miller nodded. "It checks out," Miller said, his tone neutral. He turned to Thompson, his expression tight. "We're done here." Thompson's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. He knew he had lost. The tension in the air didn't fade immediately, but it began to dissipate. Slowly, the crowd began to lower their phones, the murmurs growing softer as people realized the situation was de-escalating. As Sean was released, Aisha rushed to his side, wrapping her arms around him tightly. He hugged her back, feeling the tension leave his body all at once. "I'm okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for her or for himself. Mark stood beside them, his eyes still locked on the officers. "This isn't over," Mark said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "They're going to pay for this." The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the damage had already been done. Videos of the incident were already circulating online, and within minutes, the story of the black delivery driver harassed by the police was going viral. Sean knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Mark was not the kind of man to back down from a fight, especially not when someone he cared about was involved. As the dust began to settle from the confrontation with the police, his mind was already racing with ways to hold Officer Thompson accountable for his actions. This wasn't just about Sean anymore, it was about standing up to a pattern of racial profiling and abuse that he had seen far too often. As Sean and Aisha stood together by the side of the van, still shaken from the ordeal, Mark approached them with a determined look in his eyes. "Sean, Aisha," he began, his voice firm but gentle, "we need to take this further. What happened here today can't be swept under the rug. I'm not going to let Thompson and the police department get away with this." Aisha, her arms still wrapped protectively around Sean, nodded in agreement, though her face was a mix of fear and uncertainty. "I don't know," Mark, Sean said quietly, shaking his head. "I just want to go home to my family. I don't want to make this worse." Mark stepped closer, placing a hand on Sean's shoulder. "This isn't going to go away, Sean. They profiled you because of the color of your skin. It's not right, and if we let this slide, they'll keep doing it to you, to others. We have to make them answer for this." Sean let out a long breath, his eyes downcast. He knew Mark was right, but the weight of the situation was heavy on his shoulders. He had faced racism and discrimination before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a passing comment or a subtle snub, this was a direct attack on his dignity, his humanity. Aisha, sensing his hesitation, took his hand. "Mark's right," she said softly, looking up at her husband with a mixture of love and concern. "We can't let them get away with this. We have to stand up, not just for ourselves but for our kids, for Malik and Kendra. They need to know that we fought for what's right." Sean looked at her, his heart aching at the thought of his children. Malik was only 7, and Kendra was just 5. He had always wanted to shield them from the harsh realities of racism, to protect them from the world's ugliness for as long as he could. But now, standing here, he realized that this fight wasn't just about today, it was about their future. "Okay," Sean said finally, his voice steadying. "Let's do this. But I don't know where to start." Mark nodded, a determined smile creeping across his face. "Don't worry. I've already made a few calls. We're going to get a lawyer, and we're going." The next few days passed in a blur. Mark, true to his word, wasted no time in contacting a civil rights attorney, Thomas Gray, who had a reputation for taking on high-profile cases involving police misconduct. Gray was a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer with a history of winning cases against police departments that engaged in racial profiling and abuse of power. When Sean, Aisha, and Mark met Gray at his downtown office, the mood was tense but hopeful. Gray's office was sleek and professional, with large windows that overlooked the city. The walls were lined with framed newspaper clippings and awards from previous cases, each one a testament to his success in the courtroom. Gray wasted no time getting down to business. He sat across from the trio, his hands folded neatly on the desk as he reviewed the documents and videos they had brought with them. First things first, Gray began, his voice calm but authoritative. "The video evidence is strong. You've got clear footage of Officer Thompson profiling Sean and escalating the situation without cause. That's going to be a key part of our case. We can argue that this was a violation of Sean's civil rights under the Fourth Amendment, unlawful search and seizure." Sean shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Do you really think we have a chance?" he asked quietly, the doubt creeping into his voice. Gray looked him square in the eyes. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this, it won't be easy. Police departments have a lot of resources, and they're going to fight this tooth and nail. But with the video evidence and the public outcry, we've got a good shot. We'll file a lawsuit against the department for racial profiling and wrongful detainment." Mark leaned forward, his face set in determination. "What about Thompson? He's the one who started all this." Gray nodded. "We'll name him in the suit, too. His actions were clearly racially motivated, and we're going to make sure he's held accountable. But we'll need more than just the video, we need witnesses, people from the crowd who saw what happened." Aisha perked up at that. "I've already reached out to some of the people who were there," she said. "A lot of them are willing to testify if needed. They're angry about what happened, too." Gray smiled, clearly impressed. "That's good. The more people we have backing Sean's story, the better." Sean looked around the room, feeling a swell of gratitude for the people around him. Mark, Aisha, even strangers from the crowd, they were all standing by him, willing to fight this battle together. He wasn't alone in this, and that gave him strength. As the lawsuit was filed and the wheels of justice began to turn, the police department was forced to respond. The video of the incident had gone viral, and the public outcry was growing louder by the day. Civil rights organizations, community leaders, and activists were all calling for accountability, demanding that Officer Thompson be suspended and investigated. The police department, however, was digging in its heels. The police chief, Chief Reynolds, held a press conference to address the incident, but his response only added fuel to the fire. "We are conducting an internal investigation into the actions of Officer Thompson," Chief Reynolds said, standing before a crowd of reporters. "However, we believe that the officer was acting within the scope of his duties. The individual in question was behaving suspiciously, and Officer Thompson had reason to investigate further." The press conference did little to calm the public. Instead, it ignited further outrage. The community knew what had happened. It was clear from the video that Sean had done nothing wrong, yet the police department was refusing to take responsibility. Mark watched the press conference from his office, his jaw clenched in frustration. He couldn't believe the audacity of the police chief, standing there and defending Thompson's actions as if it were just another routine day on the job. "This is bullshit," Mark muttered under his breath, slamming his laptop shut. He knew they were in for a tough fight. The police department wasn't going to back down easily, and they were going to do everything they could to protect Thompson and their reputation. But Mark was ready. He had always been a fighter, and now, with Sean's livelihood and dignity on the line, he was more determined than ever to see this through. As the legal battle continued to unfold, the community rallied around Sean. Protests were organized outside the police station, with signs reading "Justice for Sean" and "End Racial Profiling." The protests were peaceful but powerful, sending a clear message that the people were not going to stand by and let this injustice go unchecked. Sean, still reeling from the emotional toll of the incident, attended one of the protests with Aisha and Mark by his side. As they approached the gathering, Sean was overwhelmed by the show of support. Hundreds of people had turned out, holding signs, chanting slogans, and demanding justice. One of the organizers, Tasha, spotted Sean in the crowd and immediately rushed over to greet him. "Sean, I'm so glad you could make it," Tasha said, hugging him tightly. "We've got your back. This fight isn't just yours, it's all of ours." Sean smiled, though the weight of the situation still pressed down on him. "Thanks, Tasha. I didn't expect this much support." Tasha shook her head. "You don't get it, Sean. What happened to you is happening to so many people, too many people. You standing up, fighting back, it's giving others the courage to do the same. We're not going to stop until there's justice." As they moved through the crowd, Sean was approached by people from all walks of life: black, white, Latino, young, old, all offering words of encouragement, sharing their own stories of discrimination and profiling. One woman, a middle-aged black woman with tired eyes, pulled Sean aside. "My son went through something just like this a few years ago," she said softly. "They stopped him for no reason, just because he was walking in the wrong neighborhood. He didn't fight it like you are, and I always wished he had. What you're doing, it's important." Sean nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered. "I'm just trying to do what's right." The protests swelled around them, the chants growing louder as more people arrived. It was a powerful sight, a community coming together to demand change, to fight back against the system that had oppressed them for so long. But even in the midst of the solidarity and support, Sean couldn't shake the gnawing fear in the back of his mind. The police department wasn't going to give in easily, and he knew that the real fight was yet to come. Meanwhile, Officer Thompson was facing his own internal conflict. His world had been upended by the viral video and the lawsuit. His once quiet life had turned into a media frenzy, with reporters hounding him at every turn and social media vilifying him as the face of police brutality and racial profiling. Thompson sat in his living room, staring at the TV as the news played footage of the protest outside the police station. His hands clenched into fists as he watched the crowds calling for his resignation, his suspension, even his arrest. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "They're blowing this out of proportion." His wife, Karen, sat beside him, her face a mixture of concern and frustration. "It's not fair," she said quietly. "You were just doing your job, Ryan. They're turning you into the bad guy." Thompson scowled, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he genuinely believed he had been doing his job that day, following protocol, investigating what he saw as suspicious behavior. But on the other hand, there was a small, nagging voice in the back of his mind, whispering that maybe, just maybe, he had crossed a line. The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it away, burying it beneath layers of justification and defensiveness. "They don't understand what it's like out there," Thompson said, his voice growing more agitated. "These neighborhoods, they're dangerous. I can't just ignore someone acting suspiciously. I was protecting the community." Karen nodded, though her expression betrayed her uncertainty. "I know, but Ryan, this is getting serious. They're talking about firing you. You might lose your pension, your career." Thompson's heart pounded at the thought. He had worked his entire life to get where he was, to climb the ranks of the police department. And now all of that was slipping through his fingers because of one interaction. It wasn't fair. He wasn't the villain they were making him out to be. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself of that, the nagging doubt wouldn't leave him. As the days passed, the situation continued to escalate. The lawsuit was moving forward, and the public pressure on the police department was intensifying. Civil rights organizations were joining the fight, demanding a full investigation into Thompson's conduct and calling for broader reforms within the department. Mark, ever the strategist, was already planning the next steps. He had met with community leaders, civil rights lawyers, and activists, all of them determined to turn this moment into a larger movement for change. "We're not just fighting for Sean," Mark told Gray during one of their strategy meetings. "We're fighting for everyone who's been targeted by the police just for being black or brown." This case, it's bigger than any of us. Gray nodded, his expression serious. I agree. But we need to stay focused on the task at hand. The department is going to throw everything they've got at us, and we need to be ready. Mark leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he thought about the fight ahead. Let them. We're ready. The storm was brewing, and everyone involved, Sean, Mark, Aisha, Thompson, could feel it. The legal battle was just beginning, but the outcome would reverberate far beyond the courtroom. It wasn't just about one man's rights anymore, it was about challenging a system that had oppressed countless others for generations. And as the community rallied behind Sean, the fight for justice became a symbol of something larger, a fight for dignity, equality, and the right to live without fear. The day after the protest, the story of Sean's encounter with Officer Thompson dominated the headlines. Local news stations were running segments on the viral video, while social media exploded with hashtags like Justice Forcing and End Racial Profiling. Sean's face was plastered across television screens and phones, his name becoming a symbol of the fight against police harassment. As Sean scrolled through the articles and posts, the weight of it all settled in. He never asked to be a symbol, never wanted to be the face of a movement. He was just a man trying to do his job, trying to provide for his family. But now the eyes of the community and the world were on him. Sean, you need to stop looking at that stuff, Aisha said softly, sitting beside him on the couch. Her voice was gentle, but the concern in her eyes was clear. It's only going to stress you out more. Sean sighed and put his phone down, rubbing his temples. I know, it's all so overwhelming. One day I'm delivering packages, and the next I'm at the center of a storm. Aisha took his hand, squeezing it gently. You're not alone in this. We're in this together, and so many people are standing with us. You've seen the support out there. People believe in you, Sean. They believe in what you're fighting for. He nodded, though the weight in his chest didn't ease. The support was overwhelming, but so was the pressure. With every post, every article, it felt like the stakes were getting higher. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore, it was about challenging an entire system that had been stacked against him and people like him for generations. Mark had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, organizing legal strategy meetings with their lawyer, Thomas Gray, and coordinating with community leaders. Sean was grateful for Mark's support, but he couldn't help but feel like things were spinning out of his control. As if reading his thoughts, Aisha spoke again. We're going to get through this, Sean. You're doing the right thing. We have to believe that justice will be served. Sean gave her a small smile, though doubt still gnawed at him. I hope so. Later that afternoon, Sean and Aisha met Mark and Gray at the law firm for a strategy session. Gray's office was filled with papers, files, and legal documents all related to the case. He looked up from his desk as they entered, gesturing for them to take a seat. Good to see you both, Gray said, offering a warm but focused smile. We've got a lot to go over today. The police department has officially responded to the lawsuit, and as expected, they're pushing back hard. Sean frowned, his hands clenching in his lap. What do you mean? What are they saying? Gray leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. They're claiming that Officer Thompson acted within the bounds of his authority. They're framing it as a routine stop based on suspicious behavior and argue that there was no racial profiling involved. Mark scoffed, his voice sharp. Suspicious behavior? Sean was delivering packages. That's what they're calling suspicious. Gray nodded grimly. That's their narrative, yes. They're going to argue that Officer Thompson had every reason to stop and question Sean, based on the reports of recent break-ins in the neighborhood. Sean's heart sank. He knew this was coming, but hearing it laid out so plainly still stung. They were going to try and twist the story, make it seem like Sean had done something wrong, like he had deserved to be treated like a criminal. Can they actually get away with that? Aisha asked, her voice tight with worry. Gray's expression softened, but he didn't sugarcoat the truth. It's not uncommon for departments to try and justify their actions this way. They'll point to the reports of break-ins, say Thompson was just doing his job, and hope that's enough to cast doubt on our claims. But we have the video. Mark interjected, his tone fierce. That footage shows exactly what happened. Thompson escalated the situation for no reason. Gray nodded. The video is our strongest piece of evidence, but we're going to need more than that. We need to build a solid case that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was racial profiling, plain and simple. We'll need witness statements from the people at the scene, as well as expert testimony on racial bias in policing. Sean leaned forward, his anxiety mounting. So what happens now? What's our next step? We prepare for trial, Gray replied. But we also keep the pressure on in the public sphere. The media attention is working in our favor right now. The more people talk about this, the harder it will be for the department to sweep it under the rug. Sean nodded, though his stomach churned at the thought of going to trial. The idea of standing in a courtroom, reliving that day, being cross-examined and scrutinized, it terrified him. But he also knew that backing down wasn't an option. Too much was at stake. Mark placed a hand on Sean's shoulder, offering a reassuring squeeze. We've got this, Sean. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win. As the legal case moved forward, the police department shifted into full damage control mode. Behind the scenes, they were scrambling to protect their image, doing everything they could to paint Officer Thompson as a model cop and to downplay the incident with Sean. The department's spokesperson, Lieutenant Sarah Davidson, appeared on the local news for an interview, carefully towing the line between defending Thompson and appeasing the public's demand for accountability. We take these allegations very seriously, Davidson said, her tone measured and calm. Officer Thompson is a dedicated officer with years of service to this community. While we understand the concerns raised by this incident, we believe it's important to allow the investigation to run its course before jumping to conclusions. The reporter pressed her further. But what about the video footage? Many are saying that it clearly shows Officer Thompson acting out of line. Davidson's smile was tight. We've reviewed the footage, and while we understand that the situation may have appeared confrontational, we believe that Officer Thompson was following protocol and responding to a call about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. Again, we ask for patience as the internal investigation continues. Watching the interview from their living room, Sean and Aisha were fuming. She's acting like this is all some misunderstanding, Aisha snapped, pacing the room. They're trying to make it seem like you were in the wrong, Sean. Sean sat on the couch, his hands clenched into fists. It's what they do. They protect their own, no matter what. Aisha stopped pacing and sat down beside him, placing her hand on his knee. We're not going to let them win. We're not going to let them get away with this. While the police department was putting on a brave face for the public, Officer Thompson was feeling the heat. His world had been turned upside down since the video went viral, and he found himself under more scrutiny than he had ever imagined. His fellow officers were divided. Some supported him, while others distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with the controversy. At home, Thompson sat in the dim light of his living room, nursing a beer and staring blankly at the TV. His wife, Karen, sat across from him, her face tight with worry. You need to talk to a lawyer, Ryan, Karen said quietly, breaking the silence. They're coming after you hard. You can't just sit here and hope it goes away. Thompson scowled, taking a swig of his beer. I didn't do anything wrong, Karen. I was doing my job. Karen sighed, her voice tense. Maybe you didn't mean for it to go this far, but it has. People are calling you a racist. They're saying you profiled that man because of the color of his skin. I wasn't profiling him, Thompson snapped, slamming his beer down on the coffee table. I had a job to do. There were reports of break-ins, and he was acting suspicious. That's it. Karen didn't flinch at his outburst, but her eyes were filled with concern. I'm not saying you're a bad person, Ryan, but you need to understand how this looks to everyone else. That video, it doesn't look good, and if you don't get in front of this, you could lose everything. Thompson rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. He had spent his entire career trying to protect the community, to uphold the law, and now he was being vilified as a villain. What do you want me to do? He muttered, his voice laced with frustration. Apologize. Admit to something I didn't do. Karen's eyes softened. I don't know, but I think you need to figure it out fast before it's too late. As the case progressed, tensions in the community continued to rise. Protests grew larger, with civil rights activists from neighboring cities joining the fight. The streets outside the police station were flooded with people demanding justice for Sean, chanting slogans, holding up signs, and calling for Officer Thompson's termination. One evening, as Sean and Mark stood at the edge of the protest, watching the sea of people march down the street, Mark turned to him. "This is bigger than any of us now," Mark said quietly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "This isn't just about what happened to you, Sean. It's about all the people who've been harassed, who've been profiled, who've been treated like criminals because of their skin color." Sean nodded, his gaze distant as he watched the crowd. He felt the weight of Mark's words, the truth of them sinking in. This fight wasn't just his, it belonged to everyone who had ever been unjustly targeted by the system. As the crowd continued to march, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. A line of police officers appeared at the end of the street, shields up, batons in hand. The tension was thick in the air, and Sean could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "This could get ugly," Mark muttered, his eyes narrowing as he watched the officers advance. Sean swallowed hard, his mind flashing back to the day of the incident, the fear he had felt when Thompson had ordered him out of the van. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but now it was joined by something else: resolve. "I'm not backing down," Sean said quietly, his voice steady. Mark glanced at him, nodding in agreement. "Neither am I." As the police officers moved closer, the protesters didn't budge. They stood their ground, chanting louder, their voices echoing through the night. Sean could feel the energy building, the momentum of the movement growing stronger with each passing moment. This was it. The fight was far from over, but they were ready. They were standing on the front lines of change, and there was no turning back now. As the days passed, the protests grew larger and louder. The streets of the city were flooded with people holding signs that read, "Justice for Sean and end racial profiling." Now, what had started as a local story was now gaining national attention. News outlets from across the country were picking up the story, framing it as yet another example of police misconduct and racial profiling in America. Sean and Aisha watched the news together every night, their living room filled with the soft glow of the television screen. Reporters discussed his case, analyzing every detail of the video that had gone viral. Civil rights activists appeared on talk shows, demanding accountability from the police department, while social media buzzed with calls for justice. It was surreal for Sean, seeing his life plastered across headlines and hearing strangers speak his name. He had always lived a quiet, ordinary life, and now he was at the center of a national conversation about race and police violence. "Do you ever think about how crazy all of this is?" Aisha asked one evening, her voice low as they sat on the couch together. Sean sighed, his eyes fixed on the TV every day. "I never wanted this. I just wanted to do my job and go home to you and the kids. But now, it feels like I can't escape it." Aisha nodded, her face etched with concern. "I know. But this fight is bigger than us now. People are looking to you, Sean. They're counting on you to stand up and see this through." Sean glanced over at her, his heart heavy. "I'm scared, Aisha. What if this doesn't end the way we want? What if we lose?" Aisha squeezed his hand gently, her voice firm. "Then we keep fighting. No matter what happens, we don't give up. Not for us, not for our kids, and not for all the people out there who've gone through the same thing." Sean nodded, though the fear still gnawed at him. The stakes were so high, and the outcome so uncertain. But Aisha was right, they couldn't back down now. Too many people were counting on them. The legal proceedings were moving forward at a steady pace, and the pressure on the police department continued to mount. The video of Sean's encounter with Officer Thompson had been analyzed from every angle, dissected by experts and activists alike, and it was clear to anyone watching that Thompson had acted out of line. But the police department wasn't going down without a fight. In the weeks following the initial lawsuit, the department's legal team, led by a shrewd and experienced attorney named Janet Rourke, filed a motion to dismiss the case. They argued that Officer Thompson had been acting within his authority as a police officer, responding to reports of recent break-ins in the neighborhood, and that there was no clear evidence of racial bias in his actions. Gray, Sean's lawyer, was unfazed by the motion. He had expected the police department to try to shut down the case early, but he was ready for them. "We're going to fight this," Gray said during a meeting with Sean, Aisha, and Mark at his office. "They're going to throw everything they have at us, but we're not backing down. We have the video, we have witnesses, and we have the public on our side." Sean sat across from Gray, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. "What happens if they get the case dismissed?" Gray leaned forward, his expression serious. We'll appeal. We'll keep fighting. But I don't think it'll come to that. The judge will see through their arguments. They're trying to cover their tracks, but we have too much evidence in our favor. Mark, who had been silent for most of the meeting, finally spoke up. What about Thompson? What's going on with him? Gray sighed. The police department is still standing by him for now. He hasn't been suspended, but there's a lot of pressure on them to take action. The public outcry is getting harder for them to ignore. Sean shook his head in frustration. How can they keep defending him after everything that's happened? It's right there in the video. He treated me like a criminal for no reason. It's how these things work, Gray said grimly. Police departments protect their own. But the more pressure we apply, the harder it will be for them to keep defending him. Aisha glanced at Sean, her face filled with concern. We just have to keep pushing. We can't let them win. Sean nodded, though the weight of it all pressed heavily on his shoulders. The legal battle was just beginning, and he knew it would be a long, uphill fight. But he had come this far, and there was no turning back now. As the lawsuit moved forward, the community continued to rally around Sean and his family. The protests outside the police station grew larger by the day, drawing people from all over the city and beyond. Civil rights organizations, local activists, and ordinary citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, demanding justice for Sean and calling for an end to racial profiling in the police force. One day, as Sean and Aisha were leaving a grocery store, a woman approached them with tears in her eyes. Sean, I just wanted to say thank you, the woman said, her voice trembling. My son was harassed by the police last year, and no one believed him. They dismissed his claims like they always do. But seeing you stand up, seeing you fight back, it's giving us all hope. Sean was taken aback by the woman's emotion, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He hadn't realized just how many people were looking to him as a symbol of resistance, of hope. It was overwhelming, but it was also deeply humbling. Thank you, Sean replied softly, shaking the woman's hand. I'm just trying to do what's right. As the woman walked away, Aisha placed a hand on Sean's arm. You see? People believe in you, Sean. You're giving them hope. Sean nodded, though he still felt the pressure building inside him. It was a strange feeling, being seen as a beacon of hope in a fight that felt so personal, so heavy. But if his struggle could inspire others, then maybe it was all worth it. While the public was rallying behind Sean, the police department was quietly working to discredit him. Behind closed doors, they were digging into his past, searching for anything they could use to undermine his credibility and paint him as less than a model citizen. One evening, as Sean and Aisha were sitting down for dinner, Sean's phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at the screen and felt his stomach drop. A new article had been published by a local tabloid, and the headline screamed, "Delivery driver suing police has checkered past, what is he hiding?" Aisha, noticing the change in Sean's expression, leaned over to see the article. What the hell is this, she muttered, her voice rising in anger. Sean clicked on the article and began reading, his heart pounding in his chest. The article dredged up old incidents from Sean's past minor run-ins with the law from his youth, mistakes he had made long before he turned his life around. It painted a picture of Sean as a troublemaker, someone with a history of questionable behavior. They're trying to smear me, Sean said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. They're digging up stuff from when I was a kid. Aisha's face flushed with anger. This is low. Even for them, they're trying to make you look like the bad guy to distract from what really happened. Sean set his phone down, his hands shaking with frustration. I can't believe this. I've spent years building a life for myself, for us, and now they're tearing it apart. Aisha reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. They're scared, Sean. They know they're losing, so they're trying to make you look bad. But we're not going to let them win. You've come too far to let them tear you down now. Sean nodded, though the bitterness in his chest was hard to shake. The police department was playing dirty, and it was clear that they were willing to do whatever it took to protect themselves, even if it meant dragging his name through the mud. The next day, Gray called Sean to discuss the article. They're trying to discredit you, Gray said over the phone. It's a classic tactic. They want to shift the focus away from Thompson's actions and put the spotlight on your past. So what do we do, Sean asked, his frustration evident. We stay the course, Gray replied. The public is still on your side, and this article isn't going to change that. We have the truth, and that's what's going to win this case. Sean sighed, though Gray's words offered some comfort. He knew the fight was far from over, but he also knew that he had no choice but to keep going. As the trial date approached, the media frenzy surrounding Sean's case reached new heights. Pundits debated the merits of the case on national news channels, while social media platforms buzzed with discussions about racial profiling, police misconduct, and the broader issues of systemic racism in law enforcement. One evening, Sean was invited to appear on a nationally televised talk show to discuss his case. It was a nerve-wracking experience for him. He had never been comfortable in the spotlight, and now millions of people would be watching him. Sitting in the brightly lit studio with cameras trained on him and the host, Sean felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He glanced at Aisha, who sat in the audience, her face a picture of calm support. She gave him a reassuring smile, and he took a deep breath, steadying himself. The host, a seasoned journalist named Angela Brooks, leaned forward with a compassionate smile. "Sean, thank you for joining us tonight. I know this must be an incredibly difficult time for you and your family." Sean nodded, his voice steady despite the nerves. "It is, but we're getting through it. We're just trying to do what's right." Angela's expression softened. "Your case has sparked a national conversation about racial profiling and police violence. How do you feel knowing that so many people are looking to you as a symbol of this fight?" Sean hesitated for a moment, carefully choosing his words. "It's overwhelming, to be honest. I never wanted to be a symbol. I'm just a guy trying to provide for my family. But if my story can help bring attention to the bigger issues, if it can help change things for the better, then I'm grateful for that." Angela nodded, her voice thoughtful. "Many people have watched the video of your encounter with Officer Thompson, and they see it as a clear case of racial profiling. What do you hope to achieve with this lawsuit?" Sean took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "I want accountability. I want Officer Thompson and the police department to answer for what they did. But more than that, I want change. I want this to be a wake-up call that things need to change, that people of color shouldn't have to live in fear of being harassed or profiled just for doing their jobs or living their lives." Angela smiled, clearly impressed by Sean's resolve. "Thank you for sharing your story, Sean. We wish you the best in your fight for justice." As the cameras cut to commercial, Sean let out a long breath, the weight of the moment lifting slightly. It wasn't easy, but he knew that every time he spoke out, he was helping to keep the pressure on the system that had wronged him. As the trial date loomed, the tension in the city grew palpable. The streets were filled with protesters, demanding justice for Sean and an end to racial profiling. The police department was under intense scrutiny, and Officer Thompson was beginning to crack under the pressure. Inside the police station, Thompson sat in the locker room, his hands trembling as he stared at his reflection in the mirror. His face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. The weight of the lawsuit, the media attention, and the protests had taken their toll. He was no longer just a cop doing his job, he was a symbol of everything people hated about the system, and it was tearing him apart. As he sat there, his phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer. "We need to talk. The trial is coming up fast, and we need to prepare for the worst." Thompson's heart pounded in his chest. The worst. He had always believed that he would be protected, that the department would stand by him no matter what. But now, as the storm continued to build around him, he wasn't so sure. The morning of the trial was heavy with anticipation. Sean, Aisha, and Mark sat in a quiet corner of the law office, facing Thomas Gray, their lawyer. The energy in the room was tense, yet determined. The trial that would define Sean's life for months to come was finally here, and the stakes had never been higher. Thomas Gray, as usual, was calm and methodical. His desk was cluttered with legal briefs, transcripts, and folders filled with witness statements and evidence. He looked up at Sean, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is it," Gray began, his voice steady but serious. "The trial starts today, and it's going to be a long road. But I want you to know that we're ready. The evidence is on our side. The video of the incident, the public support, and the witnesses will all work in our favor." Sean nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. He felt the weight of everything: his own reputation, the fight for justice, and the countless people relying on him. "What's our biggest challenge?" he asked. his voice slightly strained. Gray paused for a moment, considering. The police department's lawyer, Janet Rourke, is tough. She's been in the game for a long time, and she's good at discrediting plaintiffs in cases like this. They're going to argue that Officer Thompson was following protocol and that there's no clear evidence of racial profiling. Aisha, sitting close to Sean, frowned. But the video, it's so clear. How can they argue that? They'll try to twist it, Gray explained. They'll say Officer Thompson had reason to suspect Sean based on the reports of break-ins in the neighborhood. They'll try to make it seem like Sean's actions warranted the stop. Mark, who had been sitting silently, finally spoke up. We have witnesses though, right? People from the crowd who saw what happened. Gray nodded. Yes, we do. Several witnesses have agreed to testify, and that's going to be crucial. But we need to be ready for the other side to come at us hard. They're going to dig into Sean's past, bring up anything they can to paint him in a negative light. Sean exhaled slowly, his mind flashing back to the article that had been published about his checkered past. It had stung to see mistakes from his youth dragged into the spotlight. But he knew this was part of the fight. They were going to try to tear him down, but he had no choice but to stand firm. I'm ready, Sean said quietly, his voice resolute. Aisha squeezed his hand. We're all ready. We've come too far to back down now. Gray smiled faintly, appreciating their resolve. Good, let's go in there and fight. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and supporters from the community. Sean could feel the weight of their eyes on him as he sat beside Gray at the plaintiff's table, his heart pounding in his chest. Across the room, Officer Thompson sat with his legal team, looking grim but composed. The judge, Judge Helen Carter, was a no-nonsense woman with a sharp gaze that swept across the room as she called the court to order. Let's proceed, she said, her voice commanding but calm. Gray stood first, addressing the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today because my client, Sean Evans, was subjected to unlawful treatment by Officer Thompson on the basis of his race. This case isn't just about a routine traffic stop, this is about racial profiling. About a system that allows officers to target black men for simply existing in predominantly white neighborhoods. As Gray laid out the facts, Sean felt a sense of relief. Everything was being presented clearly: the video footage, the timeline of events, the hostile interaction. Gray's argument was simple and powerful. Officer Thompson had crossed the line, and Sean deserved justice. But when Janet Rourke stood to deliver her opening statement, Sean's heart sank. Her approach was sharp, calculated, and cold. Officer Thompson was responding to reports of recent break-ins in the neighborhood Rourke began. He had reason to suspect that Mr. Evans may have been involved in suspicious activity, given the circumstances. This was not about race, it was about protecting the community. Sean could feel the tension rise in the room as Rourke carefully laid the groundwork for her defense. She wasn't going to argue that Thompson had acted perfectly, but she was going to focus on justifying his actions. It was clear that her strategy was to deflect the accusations of racial bias and frame the incident as a misunderstanding driven by circumstances. They're going to try and make this about procedure, Gray whispered. The first few days of the trial were dominated by witness testimonies. Several people who had been present during the incident stepped forward, each recounting their version of events. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Maria Gonzalez, a woman who had filmed part of the incident on her phone. She was visibly nervous as she took the stand, but her voice was clear and steady as she described what she saw. I was walking my dog when I saw the police car pull up behind the van, Maria began. At first I didn't think much of it, but then I saw the way the officer was talking to Sean. It didn't feel right. He was treating Sean like a criminal from the start, even though Sean wasn't doing anything wrong. Maria's video footage was played for the court, and Sean watched as the familiar scene unfolded on the screen. His stomach twisted as he relived the moment Officer Thompson had ordered him out of the van, the hostility in the officer's voice clear. This isn't just about suspicion, Gray argued during Maria's testimony. It's about the assumptions that were made based on Sean's appearance. Officer Thompson didn't see a delivery driver, he saw a black man in a white neighborhood, and that was enough for him to escalate the situation. Rourke, however, was quick to cross-examine the witnesses, attempting to poke holes in their accounts. She asked pointed questions about whether they had seen the break in reports that had led to the increased police presence. trying to suggest that Thompson had been justified in his actions given the circumstances. Sean watched as witness after witness took the stand, each one adding another layer to the story. Some testified about the escalation, others about the way Sean had been treated. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that this was more than just a routine stop, but Rourke was relentless in her attempts to shift the narrative. The tension in the courtroom was palpable when Officer Thompson finally took the stand. Sean felt his pulse quicken as he watched the officer walk to the front of the room, his expression grim. Thompson's testimony was carefully rehearsed, his words measured and precise. He maintained that he had acted out of concern for the safety of the community, insisting that the reports of recent break-ins had made him wary of any unfamiliar vehicles in the neighborhood. "I was just doing my job," Thompson said firmly, his eyes flicking toward Sean before looking away. "There had been several burglaries in the area, and I was responding to reports of suspicious activity. When I saw Mr. Evans's van, I thought it was worth investigating." Gray stood and approached the witness stand, his expression calm but intense. "Officer Thompson, at what point did you decide that Mr. Evans was a threat?" Thompson hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "I didn't decide he was a threat. I was simply following protocol." Gray pressed further. "But you ordered him out of the van and began searching his vehicle, even after he showed you his work ID and explained that he was delivering packages. What made you escalate the situation?" Thompson's face tightened, and he shifted in his seat. "I didn't escalate anything. I was conducting a routine investigation. I had every right to check his vehicle." Gray nodded, his voice growing sharper. "So you're saying that despite Sean providing proof that he was working and had no involvement in any suspicious activity, you still felt justified in treating him like a criminal?" Thompson's jaw clenched. "I was doing my job." Sean watched as Gray continued to press the officer, but Thompson remained defiant. He refused to admit any wrongdoing, sticking to his story that he had simply been following procedure. But Gray wasn't letting up. "Officer Thompson," Gray said finally, his voice cold, "do you believe that your actions that day were influenced in any way by the fact that Mr. Evans is a black man?" The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited for Thompson's response. The officer's face grew even tighter, and for a moment, Sean thought he saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "No," Thompson said firmly. "Race had nothing to do with it." As the trial continued, it became clear that the battle would be fought not just in the courtroom but in the court of public opinion. Outside the courthouse, protests were ongoing, with demonstrators calling for justice for Sean and demanding accountability for Officer Thompson. The media coverage was relentless, with pundits debating the case on talk shows and news outlets running segments on the broader issues of racial profiling and policing. Sean's case had become a flashpoint in the national conversation about race and justice, and it seemed like everyone had an opinion. Inside the courtroom, however, the real fight was taking place. Gray had called several expert witnesses to testify about the history of racial bias in law enforcement, making a compelling case that Officer Thompson's actions were part of a larger pattern of systemic racism. One expert, Dr. Paula Richards, a sociologist who had studied racial profiling for years, took the stand and delivered a damning testimony. "Studies have shown that black men are disproportionately targeted by police in neighborhoods where they are seen as out of place," Dr. Richards explained. "This is not an isolated incident, it's part of a larger trend where assumptions are made based on race rather than behavior." Gray built on this testimony, arguing that Sean's experience was a direct result of these biased assumptions. He pointed to the video footage, the witness testimonies, and the broader context of police harassment to show that this wasn't just about one officer, it was about a system that allowed officers like Thompson to act with impunity. As the trial neared its conclusion, Gray's closing argument was powerful and emotional. "This case isn't just about what happened to Sean Evans," Gray said, his voice resonating through the courtroom. "It's about all the people who have been profiled, harassed, and treated as criminals because of the color of their skin. Officer Thompson's actions that day weren't just a mistake, they were part of a larger pattern of injustice that we cannot ignore." Sean felt a swell of emotion as he listened to Gray's words. This fight had never been just about him, it was about something bigger, something that had been brewing for generations, and now, standing on the precipice of justice, he felt a sense of hope. As the trial came to a close, both sides rested their cases, and the jury was dismissed to deliberate. The waiting was agonizing. Sean, Aisha, and Mark sat in the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, while the media swarmed outside, waiting for the verdict. Sean's mind raced as he thought about everything that had led to this moment. The incident with Officer Thompson, the protests, the public outcry, it all felt like a whirlwind, but now it was out of his hands. Aisha squeezed his hand, her face filled with quiet determination. No matter what happens, we've done everything we could. We fought, Sean. Mark nodded in agreement. And we're not done fighting no matter what. But I believe in this case. I believe the truth will win out. Sean took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The waiting was unbearable, but he knew that the moment of truth was fast approaching. As they sat in the quiet of the courthouse, the world outside buzzing with anticipation, Sean knew that whatever the verdict, they had already changed something. The fight for justice wasn't over, it never was. But they had taken a stand, and that meant something. Now all they could do was wait. The air in the courtroom was heavy with tension as everyone waited for the jury to return with their verdict. Sean sat at the plaintiff's table, his heart pounding in his chest. Aisha sat beside him, her hand wrapped tightly around his, offering silent support. Mark was there too, his face set in a determined expression, ready for whatever was to come. Thomas Gray stood nearby, his posture calm and collected, though Sean could tell that even Gray was feeling the weight of this moment. The jury had been deliberating for what felt like hours, but in reality it had only been a little over an hour since they retired to the jury room. Every minute had stretched out endlessly, the uncertainty gnawing at Sean. This was the moment everything hinged on. All the protests, the legal battles, the public support, it all came down to what the jury decided today. The door to the jury room creaked open, and the jurors filed back into the courtroom. Sean's breath caught in his throat as he watched them take their seats. Each juror had the same solemn expression, their eyes downcast as they prepared to deliver the verdict. Judge Carter called the court to order, her voice steady as she addressed the foreman of the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked. The foreman, an older man with a serious face, stood and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." Sean's heart pounded in his ears as the foreman handed a piece of paper to the bailiff, who then passed it to the judge. Judge Carter unfolded the paper and read it silently, her expression unreadable. "The defendant, Officer Ryan Thompson, is found liable for the unlawful detainment and violation of the civil rights of the plaintiff, Sean Evans," she read aloud, her voice clear. The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and whispers. Sean felt the breath leave his lungs. The tension that had been building for months suddenly released. He had won. They had won. Aisha let out a small, choked sob of relief, squeezing Sean's hand as tears welled up in her eyes. Mark slapped a hand on Sean's shoulder, a wide smile breaking through his usually stern expression. "You did it, man," Mark said quietly, his voice filled with pride. Sean sat there in stunned silence for a moment, unable to fully process what had just happened. It felt surreal, like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders all at once. He had braced himself for the worst, for the possibility that the system would fail him again. But this time, justice had been served. Judge Carter continued, her voice cutting through the murmurs in the courtroom. "As for damages, the jury has awarded the plaintiff compensatory and punitive damages totaling $1 million to be paid by the defendant and the police department." Sean's eyes widened at the number. It wasn't about the money, but the message it sent. The jury hadn't just found Thompson liable, they were sending a clear signal that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. Aisha leaned over and kissed Sean's cheek, her voice trembling with emotion. "We did it, Sean. We fought, and we won." Sean nodded, still in shock, but a smile slowly spread across his face. They had won. As Sean, Aisha, Mark, and Gray stepped out of the courthouse, they were greeted by a massive crowd of supporters and reporters. The media had been covering the trial extensively, and now that the verdict had been delivered, the story was even bigger. The crowd erupted into cheers as soon as they saw Sean. People were holding signs that read "Justice for Sean" and "End Racial Profiling." The energy in the air was electric, a palpable sense of victory that swept through the crowd. Tasha, the activist who had helped organize the protests, was at the front of the crowd. She rushed over to Sean, her face beaming with pride. Sean, you did it, she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him in a hug. This is a huge win, not just for you, but for all of us. Sean hugged her back, still feeling a little overwhelmed by everything. I couldn't have done it without you, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. You and everyone who stood by us. You all made this possible. Tasha pulled back, her eyes shining. We believed in you, Sean, and now we've shown the world that we won't stand for this kind of injustice anymore. A reporter approached them, microphone in hand, eager for a statement. Sean, how does it feel to have won this case? What do you hope comes next? Sean paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He looked out at the crowd, at all the people who had supported him throughout this journey, and then he spoke. I feel relieved, Sean began, his voice steady but emotional. But this isn't just a victory for me. This is a victory for every person who's been unjustly targeted, harassed, or profiled because of the color of their skin. What happened to me isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a bigger problem that we need to fix. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I hope this case sets a precedent. I hope it shows that we won't stay silent, that we won't accept being treated as less than human just because of how we look. We've made progress today, but the fight isn't over. There's still a lot of work to do, and I'm committed to being part of that change. The crowd erupted in applause, and Sean felt a swell of pride in his chest. He had found his voice, and now he was ready to use it to make a difference. While Sean and his supporters were celebrating outside, Officer Thompson was left reeling from the verdict. Inside the courthouse, he sat at the defense table, staring blankly at the floor as his lawyer, Janet Rourke, packed up her files. The reality of the situation was sinking in. He had lost. He had been found liable, and now his career, his reputation, and his future were all in jeopardy. The police department had already distanced themselves from him, suspending him pending further disciplinary action, and now that the jury had found him liable, it was likely that he would be terminated. Thompson stood up, his legs shaky as he tried to process what had just happened. He had spent his entire career believing he was doing the right thing, following protocol, protecting the community. But now, everything he had built was crumbling around him. Ryan Rourke said quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder, "You need to prepare yourself. The department is probably going to cut ties with you after this. There's a good chance you'll lose your pension." Thompson's chest tightened, and a wave of panic washed over him. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked, his voice strained. Rourke sighed, her expression sympathetic but resigned. "I'm sorry, Ryan. There's not much more we can do. The jury's decision is final." Thompson nodded, though his mind was racing. He knew deep down that this wasn't just about one bad decision, it was about a system that had allowed him to act the way he had, without thinking about the consequences. But that realization didn't bring him any comfort. His life was falling apart, and there was no going back. As Thompson left the courthouse, he avoided the crowd of reporters waiting outside. He didn't want to face the cameras, the questions, or the judgment. He had already been judged, and the verdict had been clear. Later that evening, Sean and Aisha sat together on their front porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It had been a long, exhausting day, but the weight of the verdict was finally starting to settle in. "I still can't believe it's over," Sean said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. Aisha smiled softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's not over, Sean, it's just the beginning. What we've done here, it's going to ripple out. It's going to inspire people to stand up and fight for what's right." Sean nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I hope so. I don't want anyone else to go through what we did. This fight, it's bigger than us." Aisha took his hand, her voice gentle but firm. "You're right. And you've shown so much strength, Sean. You've stood up for yourself, for us, and for everyone who's been through something like this. I'm so proud of you." Sean felt a swell of emotion in his chest, his heart full of gratitude for the woman beside him. She had been his rock through all of this, and he knew that without her, he might not have made it. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Aisha smiled and kissed his cheek. "We're a team. We've always been a team." As they sat there, watching the sky darken, Sean reflected on everything that had brought them to this moment. The harassment, the lawsuit, The protests, it had all been a whirlwind of pain and struggle, but in the end, they had come out stronger. For the first time in months, Sean felt a sense of peace. He knew the fight for justice was far from over. There was still so much work to be done, but for now, he allowed himself to breathe, to rest, and to take pride in what they had accomplished. In the weeks that followed, Sean's case continued to make headlines. Civil rights organizations praised the verdict, calling it a landmark case in the fight against racial profiling and police misconduct. The police department announced that it would be implementing new training programs to address racial bias and de-escalation tactics, a direct response to the public pressure that had mounted during the trial. Sean was invited to speak at rallies, community events, and even on national news programs. He had become a symbol of resilience, of standing up in the face of injustice, and his voice was being heard far beyond the boundaries of his hometown. One day, Sean received a letter from a young man named Jordan, who lived in a different state but had heard about the case. The letter was short but powerful. Dear Sean, I saw your story on the news and I just wanted to say thank you. I'm 17, and I've been harassed by the police a few times just for walking in my neighborhood. I always thought there was nothing I could do, that it was just how things are. But seeing you fight back, seeing you win, it gives me hope. I just wanted you to know that you've made a difference in my life. Thank you for standing up. Sean sat with the letter for a long time, his heart swelling with emotion. He had never wanted to be a hero or a symbol, but knowing that his fight had touched someone, had inspired someone to believe in a better future, that made it all worth it. As time passed, Sean and Aisha settled back into their lives, though things would never be quite the same. The fight for justice had changed them, made them stronger, more determined to stand up for what was right. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table with their children, Malik and Kendra, Sean looked around at his family, feeling a deep sense of contentment. "Daddy, are you famous now?" Malik asked innocently, his big eyes wide with curiosity. Sean chuckled, shaking his head. "No, buddy, I'm just your dad." Kendra giggled. "But you're on TV, Daddy. That's famous." Aisha smiled, leaning over to kiss Sean on the cheek. "He's famous to us." Sean laughed, though his heart was full. He didn't need fame or recognition. All he needed was right here, his family, his community, and the knowledge that they had made a difference. As they finished dinner, Sean looked out the window at the night sky, a sense of peace settling over him. The journey had been long, and the fight had been hard, but in the end they had won. They had stood up for justice, and in doing so they had helped to change the world, even if only a little. And that, Sean knew, was more than enough.